Spoiler alert, the Bible clearly prohibits tattoos. The point is, what is it that they're prohibiting? Then again, what does it mean to me as a practicing Christian, as a believer? Maybe from the negative standpoint, it's a mark of slavery. Don't do it.
Welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. I'm Keegan Walls, your everyday layman. And sitting by me, coming out of the right corner or your guys' left watching it, he stands at average height and his IQ slightly ahead of mine, Mark Chavalas.
Well, hello. I see you're hatless again.
I'm telling you, I got one compliment online and that was enough to do it. I'll probably wear a hat for the next episode.
I haven't received any compliments and I'm still not wearing a hat, so...
Well, there you go.
Yes.
Well, if you wore a hat, you'd get a compliment.
I did for 10 seconds.
Yeah. Well, that was your childhood Brooklyn Dodger hat.
Yes.
Well, we're excited to be back and talking about a new topic. We're going to be diving into the ever divisive topic of tattoos and whether or not you should have tattoos. And so Mark is going to give the background context to it. We're going to look at some different things. I'll turn it over to him. He'll talk on tattoos. But yeah, this can be a somewhat divisive and confrontational topic to some people. So
I'm just going to give you my stamp of approval on it. Sorry.
Yeah, nice.
That didn't work.
Nice pun. No, it worked. So we want to just kind of add to that conversation, hopefully dispel any confusion, or at least, again, give the background context and commentary, so to speak, to the issue, since it's like entirely from the Old Testament. And so going to be looking at that, and that's coming from a guy who, I don't even know if you can see it, does have a tattoo. So there you go. And your son's tatted up to wazoo. So I guess we'll find out where we land.
I don't have any yet, but we'll see what happens. And of course, this topic is different. I mean, the previous topic about Abraham and the covenant rituals, probably not immediately relevant to our life. We don't normally do rituals like that. Tattoos are, of course, a different issue. They weren't when I was a kid, by the way. They certainly are now. And so you have to look at the cultural context and say, all right, so, I mean, spoiler alert, the Bible clearly prohibits tattoos. The point is, what is it that they're prohibiting? What's the context of the prohibition? And of course, then again, what does it mean to me as a practicing Christian, as a believer? How do I now respond to the Old Testament, not just to tattoos, but to a lot of other things? And though I don't plan to be comprehensive about that issue, I think I'm going to try to give you a couple of pointers about how to respond to things in the Old Testament that are either prohibited or strongly encouraged to do. What is it? What is our responsibility as Christians? And to me, not so much the end result of what I'm doing here. I think I'm hoping it'll be the method that I do it that'll be important for you to say, all right, this is how I go about looking at a passage, any passage. It just happens to be one that has become controversial. Like I said, over the past half century. It certainly wasn't when I was a kid, by any stretch of the imagination. I happen to have written a very small popular article on this for Biblical Archaeology Review, volume 42/6 in 2016, if you're interested in taking a look at it. It sort of gives the skeletal structure of what I'm going to talk about, because I'm planning on looking at the one half verse that talks about it. By the way, there's only one place in the entire Bible that presents the prohibition, so it must not have been a big deal. There is no rationale given behind the prohibition, which tells me it was probably pretty obvious to everyone why the prohibition was there. I want to look at what's happening in the context of the passage. And so we're basically going into Adventures in Leviticus if you want to look for a title.
There you go.
Okay. And so we'll look at that. Then I will look at how the passage has been interpreted throughout the centuries. Not everyone, but I'll be looking at a couple of Jewish commentators in the ancient period, and then some modern commentators. I even brought a couple of my Leviticus commentaries. I'm sure all of you have loads of Leviticus commentaries.
I read them every night to my kids before they go to bed.
Well, that will probably help them get to sleep, that's for sure. And then, as you might guess, I'm going to venture into Mesopotamia because any Mesopotamian scholar, if they were asked about tattoos, they would probably do a double take like, well, of course I know what tattoos are for. We know exactly what they were for in Mesopotamia. I'm not going to tell you right now. But my guess is whatever they were used for in Mesopotamia is the context and background for how they're being used in the book of Leviticus. So just keep that in mind. In fact, I'm going to read the first mini paragraph of my popular article. For those of us over 50, any mention of a person with tattoos often brings to mind a rowdy sailor or a motorcycle gang member. That's old people. Okay. Over the past generation, however, the art of tattooing has become part of mainstream culture, part of a larger phenomenon that includes the art of body piercing. It is not just young people who engage in this form of body art. Many of those who have tattoos are at the social forefront of society: mothers, business people, and sports stars. By the way, you probably already knew all this stuff, but I had to at least put a context to it. The biblical writers clearly condemned the practice of tattooing. Leviticus 19:28, which we'll be looking at in a second, prohibits cutting or marking the body. No reason is given in the verse, however, which probably means it was obvious to the ancient reader, but not to us. Okay. The larger context of the passage is concerned with pagan mourning practices and idolatry. Thus, tattooing has traditionally been deemed guilty by association with other pagan rites. That's what I want to look at. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Think of the article that I looked at. So we're going to venture into the book of Leviticus. I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to evaluate Leviticus on its own terms at this point. Any more to say is that I think Leviticus, well, it's part of the 5 books of Moses. And I really think if you look at from Genesis all the way through to Kings, it is a unit that has been put together and edited together by a divinely inspired editor. The final edition is quite late. It doesn't mean that there isn't material in the text from Genesis to 2 Kings that is not early. I don't want to go there and describe exactly what that means, but I've already talked a little bit about it in a previous podcast. But the point is that whatever the case is, whether the text is early or a late edition, it's divinely inspired. That's how I look at it as a practicing believer, and so I'm not nearly as concerned or bothered by that issue. Leviticus itself is a good unit. When the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, was created, they did divide it up into 5 scrolls, and that's why we have the 5 books of Moses. But I think in many respects, conceptually, it's meant to be one large one, and it's part of a larger whole, like I said, Genesis to 2 Kings. So just keep that in mind. There are very good arguments for looking at Leviticus chapter 17 through 27, that 11-chapter section, as a holiness code. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, this is a section that is clearly demarcated to show why Israel is different than the nations. God is marking them out as something unique and different, and so and this is part of the covenant, of course. We're gonna see that Israel is different than the nations by certain characteristics that they have that stand out from the nations. So if you think of it that way, it might provide a little bit of context for trying to understand not just Leviticus 19:28b, this section about tattoos, but the section as a whole. Then, like I said, try to come to grips with the whole issue of how we apply that. And of course, as present-day believers, you can find them through, on both ends of the spectrum, where those who say, no, we need to abide by all of them, we're still under the same covenant, to those who said, no, we can flat out ignore it completely. We are completely under grace and we don't even need to worry about it. In fact, the only reason for the Old Testament is that it's a shadow to help us to look at more important things to come. And so I'm going to try to find where that common ground is between all of those things. But of course, that is sort of theology. And so I'm already getting, a little antsy here about that. But I'm going to do the best I can. So let's start maybe by looking at let's go to Leviticus 18 for a second. And I'm going to look at the first 2 or 3 verses in Leviticus 18. It's a good chapter division. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. Editorial translation. If you were wondering where this is coming up, this is now a divine word. Stop what you're doing, God's speaking. And then he says, you shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt where you live, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. And so what God is saying is make sure that you forget what happened in Egypt about those customs. And of course, the context here is about sexual purity, as we're going to find out at some other point. And so make sure that you don't abide by what they do and don't abide by the people groups that are living in the land that I'm going to show you. So this is anticipating the entry into Canaan at this point. And then God talks about, in very, very basic terms, sexual taboos in ways that seem remarkably elementary. But if you think about this people group coming out of a situation where they're in their mind total corruption, they had to start at ground zero, in the same way that Lombardi famously brought a football out to the Packers after a loss and said, let's start at ground zero. This is a football. Okay, so that's what it says in 18. Then you get to 19, and I would say that 19 is probably a good chapter division, because it is talking primarily about idolatry. And of course, what is idolatry? It's being disloyal to God. You're giving your loyalty over to something or someone else. And like I've said before, the Israelites did consider that the something else was very real. It was wrong to associate yourself with these real issues, these other creatures, these heavenly beings, these corrupt beings that were in rebellion against the true God. So stay away from them, not because they were fake, but because they were real. So you get to 19, and there are a number of stipulations. And I want to get down to verse 26 for a minute to get to my point. Let me just move a paper here, because I've got a note or two that make sure that I don't forget what it is that I want to talk about. So let's get down to verse 26. You shall not eat anything with the blood, nor practice divination or soothsaying. You shall not round off the side growth of your heads, nor harm the edges of your beard. Okay, so that's interesting. You shall not make cuts in your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourselves. And then it gives the statement, I am the Lord. In other words, in case you forgot, this isn't coming just from Moses. This is direct line from God himself. So there's the prohibition. And so the question is, of course, what do we do with this prohibition? So what are we being told in this and by the way, after that, it clearly is a subject change, although my argument is going to be that there already was a subject change in the middle of this, spoiler alert. So in 26, you're told, don't eat anything with the blood. And of course, we're told in a number of places in Leviticus and elsewhere that the blood is it's the life force that one has. And so you don't eat it. If you lose it, you've lost some of your being. You need to be replenished. And then that's connected. It's at least grammatically connected to practicing divination or soothsaying, which are pagan practices, put it this way, divination is not a pagan practice. There is Israelite divination where you can ask God, but you have to do it through appropriate means. And so this is, of course, talking about pagan divination or soothsaying. Then it's talking about rounding off the edge of your beard. Is that dependent upon what I just read? I'm going to give you a guess that it might not be. And then it's talking about making cuts to your body for the dead or tattoo marks. So I guess the first question will be, what's the word there for a tattoo? Okay, because it's actually there's no ancient word for a tattoo. That's a relatively modern term. I think it's Polynesian, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't bother to look it up. So what's the word there? Well, guess what? It's one of those one single attestation words, hapax legomena in ancient Greeks, which means a one and only one occurrence of a word. The context clearly is talking about something, either a marking or an incision. There's no guarantee that I know exactly what it is. Is it congruent with the concept of tattoo? Not necessarily, but I think it would be. I suppose you could technically say if you decided to carve somebody's name on your arm, that would be applicable to tattooing. In other words, and I don't think anybody's arguing that it's exactly like a modern tattoo, but it's certainly forbidding something that looks as if the implication is that it's permanent. Okay. But when I look at rabbinical commentaries about this, it's hard to follow. In other words, they struggle with trying to understand exactly what the prohibition is. And so it's really, in other words, for me to figure out, I've got the answer, I'm going to figure all this out, it would be sort of presumptuous of me to think that I've done that. But it looks as if it's part of a mourning ritual because that's what just happened. Think about it. Let's read 28 again. You shall not make any cuts into your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Now, interestingly enough, and you've probably noticed this, quite often there's repetition in the laws. I think I've mentioned this before. If you look at Levitical laws and then you look at and laws in Exodus and then you look at laws in Deuteronomy, they often will duplicate a law, but usually with some slight variation. Here's their duplication a little bit later. So if you go to Leviticus 21, verse 5, for example, these are regulations concerning priests, okay, which, by the way, are usually, if anything, more narrowly focused, but they're usually focused to what and the average Israelite would still be prohibited to doing. So 21:5, they shall not make any baldness on their heads, nor shave off the edges of their beards, nor make any cuts in the flesh. And then the sentence is over, and it goes on to another subject. Well, it says they'll be holy to their God. But it's missing there. In other words, when they make cuts to their flesh, that clearly is that's connecting to mourning rituals. But there's nothing about the tattoo mark. So the suspicion there is that the tattoo might not be connected to mourning rituals. Now, historically, it has been connected to it. And so The first thing I think I want to do is to maybe take a look at mourning rituals, first of all, as to how they're practiced in the Old Testament. Instead of going through verses, maybe I'll just give you a couple of verses and you can take a look at them. But, for example, if you look at, for example, 2 Samuel 13:31, Job 1, verse 20, when you are in a terrible grieving moment, there is tearing of your garments, and then there's sackcloth and sometimes pouring ashes over your heads. But you know what they don't do is they do not cut themselves and they do not put tattoo marks on themselves. Now, if you look at the ancient Near East concerning mourning rituals, we don't know a lot about them, by the way, but what we do know is that when you find mourning rituals in the ancient Near East, tattoos are never associated with them. In other words, they might cut up your flesh. And so, for example, here's a note by Joanne Skurlock, who I've talked about before. This is magic and medical means of dealing with ghosts. This is a sort of a summary of a larger book that she has. I'm on page 139, note 899, where she's describing it's an exorcism, but in the middle of it, they're talking about a mourning ritual. And it says that the goddess, my hair will whirl around in heaven for you like a whirlwind. With my fingers, I'll scratch out my cheeks for you as with a boxwood pin, says Geshtinana in Dumazi's dream. Then Ninshuber scratched her face. She scratched her nose. She scratched her thighs. And then it describes the fact that she's describing the fact that she was scratching her midsection, her reproductive parts. And then it goes on, she dressed in a single garment. In other words, she's doing something that is considered to be a mourning ritual, but there's no tattooing. At Ugarit, which is the Canaanite city on the coast, that has tremendous connections to the Bible. The language there, Ugaritic, is a version of Canaanite, which would be roughly similar to biblical Hebrew. When I say roughly, I don't want to go into all the differences, but from Pritchard's Ancient Near Eastern Text, which I brought before, I decided to bring one page with me today and not the whole thing. I'm on page 139. Ginsburg has a translation of one of the Baal poems about, and it's describing the death of Baal. It says that Baal is dead. This is line 10 on section 6, line 10. Straightway kindly El Benign descends from the throne, sits on a footstool, from the footstool and sits on the ground, pours dust of mourning on his head, earth of mortification on his pate, and puts sackcloth and loincloth. He puts a gash with a stone, incisions with at such and such. And no, he's cutting himself. He gashes his cheeks and chin. He harrows the roll of his arm. He plows his chest like a garden, and etc. In other words, he's grieving, and that's the way of grieving. But there doesn't appear to be any evidence that, whether in Mesopotamia or at least at Ugarit, I know these are just a few small examples of marking themselves in their body in terms of mourning rituals. And so the guess is that they're probably not using it. However, that's exactly what the rabbis thought. So now I go to a little article. Stop me if you've heard this before. Which I think that you might get a kick out of, by the way. I mentioned this journal before called The Torah, which is online, and it's popular. It's for interested parties, and so it's thetorah.com. This is about 3 years ago. David Bernat wrote an article, Tattoos, What Exactly is Prohibited? And he really wrote a very smart and concise article about what rabbis and even modern clerics have thought about this passage. And I think it's very relevant to go through a couple of these because it might help explain what it is. And I would say I probably made the same arguments myself a decade or two ago until I was confronted with having to study this. In other words, if you would have asked me 10 or 15 years ago, should I get a tattoo? I said, well, I would encourage you not to get a tattoo because the Bible prohibits it. And it's, of course, since we're made in the image of God, we shouldn't mar our body. That was actually a rabbinical argument and even a modern Christian argument, but it actually isn't the one that is used in the Bible for prohibition for tattoos. In fact, there is no argument given. That's the whole point, is that it doesn't tell you. And usually when you're not told why something is prohibited, it's because for the ancient mind, it was probably obvious. And so my goal is to try to figure out what that obvious is. So anyway, Bernat, he brings up the issue of the word kaka, this word for marking or whatever. It's this single word usage. And so if I'm not exactly sure what the word means, I can't exactly be dogmatic about it. But he brings up a Dead Sea Scroll, which I'm going to bring up before. I've already showed you this book by Michael Wise, Martin Abegg, and my friend or my colleague, Edward Cook. I got to know him in school, like I said before. And I'm in the Temple Scroll that was found in the Dead Sea area. And at this point, it does talk about, I didn't mark it. Here we go. Forbidden mourning and burial practices. You are children belonging to the Lord your God. Therefore, you are not to gash yourself nor to shave your forelocks on behalf of the dead. You must not incise your flesh or tattoo yourselves for the dead, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. Interesting. This is very much a fascinating commentary. So this is just before the Christian era. A commentary on Leviticus 19:28, but it's adding the reason behind it because, like I said before, the second half of Leviticus 19:28 was assumed to be associated with the previous part of the text. And of course, you're probably thinking to yourselves, well, that makes sense that it would be. So before I go any further with this, let me give you a couple verses in context in Leviticus 19:3, just to show you that the ancient mind and how the ancient Near Eastern mind, the way they organize things is really different than us. We're going to spend a lot more time about this when I talk about the law codes, the Hammurabi Code. When I look at the Hammurabi Code, the first thing I think of is, why did they order these things in the way they did that? Not only did they put certain laws together, they don't seem to go together. I wouldn't put them together. And then they repeat themselves later on. Why didn't they just collect all these and put them together over here? And you know why? Because they've got a different way of thinking. They have a different way of thinking, a different way of organizing. The Bible does too. If you're honest with yourself, even looking at the organization of the laws in Exodus and the like, it seems to be repetitive. It seems to be redundant at some points. I mean, for example, Leviticus 18, we have all these laws concerning sexual taboos. And then Leviticus 20, 2 chapters later, we have pretty much the same taboos described with the penalties for them. And of course, what do you want to say tongue in cheek? Go back to Moses and say, hey, you could have collected them all together and just put the penalty with the taboo, and then you could have saved, a couple lines of text, for the volume. But of course, that's our way of thinking, and their way of thinking is not ours. And even if I don't understand it, and by the way, there's a point to this. So let's go back to Leviticus 19 for a minute and see if I can help you explain this. Look, Leviticus 19:3. Every one of you shall reverence his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Now, this is my point. Those two statements that are really, really good statements, honor your father and mother and keep the Sabbath, okay, they're really good things, but they're not dependent upon each other. In other words, theoretically speaking, I can keep the Sabbath without honoring my father and mother and vice versa. Now, of course, it would be bad if you did one without the other, but the point is they are two intellectually separate entities. Why are they collected together? Because they're collected together. What's the next verse I want to look at here? Verse 16. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people, and you are not about to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. Again, those are two conceptually different things that are not dependent upon each other, if that makes sense. Verse 30. You shall keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Again, those are two conceptually different entities. My suggestion is verse 28 could be in the same, in fact, I believe it is in the same pattern. And so let's read it again. You shall not make any cuts into your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. I believe those are two conceptually different entities that are not dependent upon each other. And so tattoo marking is not part of a mourning ritual. It does not exist anywhere in the ancient Near East. And so if that's the case, I now need to go and continue to investigate to see why it's not found anywhere else and what is the big deal. Because, by the way, there is a lot of tattooing in the ancient Eastern world. And so I need to find that. And again, the whole point of this podcast is to try to look at the Bible in its context to see what's going on. And like I said, I'm giving you my best shot. And sometimes my best shot, doesn't get to the point of, being dogmatic about it. That's for sure. By the way, I'm going to get back to Bernat for a minute. This is page 2 of his article. The Septuagint has grammata sticta, basically tattooed or incised writing for the word that is used for caca here. And so they become more they become more explicit about it. Tattoos are engravings that can include letters or images. Medieval commentators clarify that tattoos are permanent. In fact, in other words, now the commentators and talking about this passage is saying you can mark yourself if it's not permanent. If it's permanent, that's the prohibition. But of course, that's not what the text says. Okay, in other words, they've gone past the text, but of course, that's the whole point of rabbinical commentaries. They're trying to make sense of it. And so they're saying, is this a blanket prohibition or not? I'm not going to give you all the specific section, the specific rabbinical text, but you can look at Bernat's article, which all of you can access in a second. If you look up David Bernat, the Torah, you'll get the article up. So, for example, one of them says, one who writes incise writing, if they write but do not incise, or incise but do not write, they are not liable. In other words, if you simply write on yourself, that's okay. If you simply mark yourself, that's okay. But if you incise with writing, that's not okay. Until they write or incise in ink or coal or anything marked. That's one. Now, in support of this blanket prohibition, you can look at a number of modern commentaries. So, by the way, I brought a couple of Leviticus commentaries with me today. And I do plan on talking about commentaries, which ones I use, which ones I'm most comfortable with. As you're going to guess, usually it's the old and moldy ones that I like the best. But I brought 3 here, and I'm just going to briefly mention them. Gordon Wenham in the New International Commentary in the Old Testament. This is the book of Leviticus. You can see it's not real thick. Word Biblical Commentary by John Hartley, a little thicker. A relatively newer one is Kiyuchi's Apollos Old Testament Commentary on Leviticus. They're all called Leviticus for some odd reason. Series editors David Baker and Gordon Wenham. This is a really nice commentary series. I only have 1 or 2 of these. If I looked up the passage and I collected what they say in their commentary about the passage, it's less than half a page total. In other words, it wasn't on their radar. It's obvious it's prohibited, and for the most part, they look upon it as either a blanket prohibition because of mourning practices, or they argue, for example, that it's prohibited because humans are created in the divine image, and they hearken back to Genesis 1:26 and 27. While I like that principle, I don't like their interpretive method. I don't think that you can go there and argue that simply because we're made in the divine image that we can mar ourselves. Because think about it, they're wearing earrings, they're wearing nose rings, and of course maybe they're not as permanent. Although if you have a nose ring, you have made a permanent, you have marred your flesh. Oh, excuse me. Just notice something for the first time. But the point is that you've done something that is analogous to tattoo, I would say, and there's no prohibition against that for males or females, etc. And so you have to look at that and say, what's going on here? I wanted to have. Go ahead.
My question would be off of that, which is that a little bit bringing down a level to all that encompasses the phrase "made in the image of God"? That it's not just physical either. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it's part of our being.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot to it more than just, well, he made us to look like him. That's it.
Yes, but we obviously we did a whole podcast, maybe more than a podcast, on Genesis 1:26 and 27, and the whole issue of image. And it's certainly a whole lot more than looking like God. And of course, how can we look like God since God doesn't have a body? So that already breaks down to begin with. And so my issue is that the term, the Akkadian term, means statue. And so we're clearly some sort of representation of God, or maybe a representative of God. And so it probably has nothing to do with changing our body form, although I'm not encouraging you to change your body form. But the point is, I don't think it's talking about that. But it's also, think about it. I mean, your inner being, I mean, your personality is marred when you sin. And so I suppose I could argue, you're messing up your image as an image bearer when you go against God. And so it seems like a lot deeper than whether or not I've marked up my body or not. And so I really think it's ultimately, I think it's a weak argument. By the way, I did bring up one other commentary, which I mentioned before. It's the commentary that everyone else uses when they're working with the Leviticus commentary, Jacob Milgram's 3-volume commentary. Mercifully, I only brought the middle volume. By the way, so this one's thicker than all the others, and it's only 6 chapters of Leviticus. It's the middle chapter, Leviticus 17 through 22. And so if you really want to do a deep dive in Leviticus, which like I said, my friend Rico Cortez does, and so he's looking at this and salivating. He says, "Oh, I've got that. I'm running to get it right now." In fact, it's probably not more than 2 feet away from Leviticus, from Rico at all times. So anyway, if you start looking at his commentary, he does a really serious dive on this, and he begins to suspect that there's something else going on other than mourning rituals. And this was, I think, published in around 2000. So about 25 years ago or so. So I'm just going to keep this in mind that I think he came up with the answer, but he didn't follow up on it. Understandably, there was a lot of reasons for it. So a couple of other rabbis, just to show you what their struggle is that one medieval rabbi says, only if you write something on it, like "I am Yahweh." No, as Bar Kapara teaches, they are not liable until they write an idolatrous name, as it says, and do not put in size writing on yourselves. Okay. Ben Kapara views from another 12th century commentary. This too is a rule about idolatry, since it was the general practice of polytheists to write the name of their god on their flesh. Actually, that's probably not wholly correct. So Ibn Ezra, 12th century. Some say that the tattoo prohibition is linked to gashes in your flesh for the dead, because there are those who mark their body in a known manner with flame for the dead. To this day, there are people who mark their faces in their youth to make themselves recognized. Well, that's interesting that he's talking about, for him, a modern concept, but there really isn't any ancient parallel to it. So I know you're all wondering, well, what on earth, when are you going to get to the point? Soon. So, this is about as far as I'm going to get. Now, with this. Now, recently, a very detailed scholarly article came out on this. So let me see if I can find it here. Here it is. Which you all should have access to if you really want to do a deep dive into the subject. And some of you may want to do a very serious dive in this. It's simply called The Biblical Prohibition Against Tattooing. The first author is John Hunegard, who I brought up before. He was the guy who wrote the great Akkadian grammar that everyone uses. And Harold Leibowitz, they both were at the University of Texas, Austin. This came out in 2013, so it's not a new article any longer. It's been out for a dozen years. It's in the journal called Vetus Testamentum, Latin, but it's a Dutch journal. It simply means Old Testament. Wow, it really probably spent years coming up with that title. But this is, what year is it? It's 2013. I think 63, volume 63, if you're looking up. But if you actually looked up Vetus Testamentum 63, Hunegard, it should come up, and hopefully you can have access to it. But anyway, I'm going to give you their abstract to it and then not detail the rest of the article. He says, or they say, Leviticus 19:28 prohibits tattooing, but no reason for the prohibition is given. I know I already said that, but I'm going to keep on getting there. Since it appears in a context of pagan mourning practices, it's assumed that the reason for prohibition lay in its association with mourning practice. I tried to show that's not necessarily so. In this paper, we explore the broader context of the law in biblical times and how it was understood in subsequent rabbinic times. Now, what they do in more detail than I just did was they first go through the rabbinical material to show you, yes, this is what they thought. It was associated with mourning rituals. And if you think about it, the rabbinical commentaries are now disassociated from the biblical context themselves. They are now making commentaries, well, guess what? For their own time period, just like if I write a commentary today, I might want to look at the ancient material, but the whole point of the commentary is to make the ancient material relevant for the present. Go figure. And so when I'm doing it, I have to understand, the spirit of my own age. Well, that's easy. I'm living in it, so I don't have to. I'm living it, I'm living in it and breathing it myself, and so I don't have to worry about the spirit of my age, but I do have to worry about how to try to apply the context. And so that really, if you think about it, that's what I'm doing here. So, and then it says, and how it was understood in rabbinical times, we propose that in the biblical period, the prohibition was associated, here's the spoiler alert, with the marking of slaves, and that in the subsequent rabbinic period, it was associated with paganism. And ultimately, what they're nicely saying is that historically speaking, it was not accurate. And so what Hunegard and Luberz do in more detail is, and these other articles are dependent upon it, and they did this after Milgram's guess about this. This is exactly what Milgram guessed, is that they said the whole point of the marking is that this is the mark of a tattoo is like the mark of a branding. Okay. And if you think of it that way, then it would be pretty obvious to me why it doesn't have to be brought up. I'm going to provide my evidence as we go on, but think about it. If Keegan came down here and he was wearing an orange jumpsuit and maybe had an ankle bracelet on, I would probably scratch my head and say, hey, buddy, is there anything you need to tell me? He says, well, you probably would be saying, I've got about 3 hours. That's it. I have to be somewhere, real soon. And I'm thinking, well, normally people who wear that are incarcerated. Is there, something else you'd like to tell me? I want him to be the one having to wear it, not me. Or when I was a young man, of course, it would be a black and white striped outfit. Today it's orange and sometimes yellow, and whatever. I've been on jury duty, so I've seen a few of those from the outside looking in. But the point is that nobody has to tell us in this day and age in America, if I saw a guy walking around in an orange jumpsuit, nobody has to tell me why that's sort of odd. If somebody came into my classroom wearing an orange jumpsuit, I might either ask them a few questions and then probably call security. Hey, I think we got a live one in here. But the point is that I don't have to say anything else other than orange jumpsuit, in room, 642. I don't know what's going on here.
Was that your classroom number?
I'm not telling. I like numbers, and so I just threw out a number.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Go check. Of course, I didn't tell you what building either. All right. So, if that's the case, that would explain why there's no discussion about it. And I think there's juicy irony here. If this is true, think about who Moses is talking to in Leviticus. He's talking to a bunch of people that just came out of Egypt who probably have slave brands on them. In other words, they're probably saying to Moses, "Oy vey, I'm really not worried about marking myself. We all got them." And so what's Moses saying? Don't mark anybody else. That's the slave mark. And I'm being a little facetious here, but I'm trying to get at what's really going on. And if you think about it, the whole concept of marking or incising is described in poetic terms in the Bible, and you're probably not going to like this, and you're probably just going to say, well, that's just poetry. But I'm going to throw it out anyway. I'm going to go to the book of Isaiah for a minute and look at two passages. And of course it's poetic license, but I think the principle behind it, if it was intrinsically wrong, I don't think that even the Isaiah source would ever give it to you. So Isaiah 44:5. Well, this is, by the way, God talking to Jacob, my servant, and Israel, whom I've chosen. And God's talking to him as if this is a little child that he gave birth to. And so this, I formed you from the womb. Who will help you? Do not fear, O Jacob, my servant. Verse 2. I will pour out water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour out my spirit on your offspring and my blessing on your descendants. And he continues on in verse 5. This one will say, I am the Lord's. And that one will call on the name of Jacob. And another will write on his hand, belonging to the Lord. And of course, this is what you did, for ownership. We found lots and lots of vessels, even jar vessels, with a stamp on them, Hamelech, meaning this is a royal jar or whatever. In other words, it's belonging to the king, or I suppose it'd be like belonging to the government or something. Is that, clearly this is government owned property, and you know that, and so you're not going to mess with it. And so the stamp on it denotes ownership. And so in this beautiful poetic way, it's saying that someday everybody's going to if they're going to stamp themselves, they're going to put the Lord on it. In other words, look, everybody, I belong to the Lord. That's who I'm loyal to. I couldn't change if I wanted to. So it's actually a beautiful rendition. And then it even goes further. If you go a little bit further in Isaiah chapter 49, about 14 through 16, here's God speaking again. And this time, this is God talking about Zion forsaking him. But the other way around. Zion says, the Lord has forsaken me, and the Lord has forgotten me. And of course, this is how we all feel sometimes. And of course, what's the theology? Who moved? It's not us. It's not God. It's us. Can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? In other words, do you think I forgot you? I bore you. How could I ever forget you? Kind of like a child asking a mother, did you forget me? Even these may forget, but I will not forget you. And then 16, Behold, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. And by the way, in 44:5, it says generically the word right. Here it uses a word. It's not the same as one in Leviticus 19. It can't be because that's a single word. But this one basically, it's as if it literally means I inscribed on my hands, which implies permanence. I inscribed you on my palms. It doesn't even say hands, but obviously, where are your palms? They're on your hands. And so in other words, in fact, why would I put them there? That way, where do I use my hands? All the time. I'm always going to see your name there. And so it's a beautiful image. And it's if I think of it in the same way, that one, by the way, would not denote necessarily ownership, but memory. And of course, think about it. Why would you brand a slave either with a name or a sentence, as we're going to find out? It's because if Keegan's my slave and he runs off, he runs down the street, I've already on his forehead saying, if found, please bring back to such and such a house. He's a runaway. In fact, we actually have something like that, as we're going to find out later. So, are you convinced yet, or do I have to go on? Okay.
Not quite convinced. I need a little bit more convincing.
Yeah. That's a great. So now let's delve into Mesopotamia to try to see the whole issue of branding, because it's overwhelming. There are literally dozens and dozens of texts about branding. It's just about always slave marking. Before that, maybe one or two classical references. By the way, these are references that we've always had, but they weren't necessarily, they didn't seem to be immediately relevant to us. Let's see if I can find that. Yeah, that's my problem, always missing it. Well, I'm not going to worry about it right now. I'm simply going to tell you, both in Diodorus and in Herodotus, it talks about slaves being branded in two very particular contexts. And again, it's as usual for both of them, it's very anecdotal, and then they move on as if you sort of already know this. But it seems rather practical that you would brand people for the purposes of identification. And of course, the irony about this, of course, is that the horrid practice that was done, especially, during World War II, to Jews and other people. Now, in Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium, we begin to see the practice of branding. And as usual, when I go into the weeds in Mesopotamia, none of the texts are there to inform me about the topic that I'm looking at. In other words, there's no branding text. This is how you brand, and this is what you do, and this is why you do it. There's nothing like that at all. And so here's a 3rd millennium text. I'm going to give you a couple references because there's a few very good articles about this. Not this one. It simply says, in terms of tattoos, the practice of inflicting permanent forms of marking begins sometime in the 3rd millennium at the Sumerian city of Adab. We find evidences for it, and it looks as if it continued on for about 3,000 years in Mesopotamia. For a while, scholars were arguing that it skipped about 1,000 years. But of course, as soon as you say that, the only reason you say it is because they didn't find any evidence for it, and then they do, and that's pretty typical. And I think scholars often do that. If we don't find the evidence, it doesn't exist. And then they find the evidence, oh, it exists. Rather than saying, we're going to guess the evidence is probably in between this period and that period, even though we didn't find it. It doesn't just die and then pop up again. So one text for the Ur III period, which is around 2100 BC and following, lists a Sumerian term, which means a copper brand for humans. Ooh, okay. Another, copper markers for various categories of livestock. Oh yeah, you brand animals today. This is the same. The principle is the same. I own cows, I own sheep, I own Keegans. And so I'm going to brand him in the same way. You're thinking that's rather, inhuman of doing that. Well, perhaps it is. But the point is that was very typical, and they're not concerned about that. We even have somebody who has a boat brand. I don't exactly know what a boat brand is. One brands a woman. He is the merchant of the slave. In another text, a slave is described as bearing the brand of a king. So, again, these are fragmented, haphazard, at least from our standpoint, And so you're thinking, here's a list of gifts and a memorandum about. This is all letters. This is from the State Archives of Assyria that I've mentioned before. So this is first millennium material. And here's a writer basically given a list of audience gifts. And then at the very end, he has a little memorandum concerning the 3-year-old domestic slaves to the palace for evidence. They haven't been brand marked yet. That's all it says. And what the point there is clearly guilty by association. The slaves haven't been branded yet. Therefore, slaves are branded. Does that mean all slaves are branded? Well, it doesn't tell us that. Does that mean nobody else is branded? Not necessarily, but in the documents that we have, it's almost overwhelmingly slaves that are being branded. And yes, we are going to do 1, 2, or maybe even 3 episodes on the whole concept of ancient slavery, because it, of course, is bothersome for people. Victor Horowitz wrote a really interesting article called, or the subtitle, Marking Slaves in the Bible in Light of Akkadian Sources. And his issue is the slave mark that is used in Exodus 21 when the slave is given his freedom and he says, no, I want to stay, and he takes an awl and marks his ear. Well, that's pretty permanent, wouldn't you say? That seems pretty analogous to the prohibition in Leviticus 19. And so it looks as if it would contradict the whole issue, but that is a slave mark there. And here's a slave who was willingly staying and keeping the mark, and that's duplicated, by the way, almost identically in Deuteronomy 15. I think it's verse 17. You can look it up. But anyway, he has this is one of these bilingual texts, and it's describing now full sentences, and it's talking about slaves. It says, oh, he's shaven him, he's marked him with an abutu, which we don't know what it is, but it's a slave marking, which is probably something regarding hair, maybe even a single curl, because we know that slaves either had to shave all or part of their head, and so maybe they had a slave marking, which, of course, if you start running away and you've got a slave mark, it's like, bring him back. He has not complied with his master. He's fled from his master's house. After he fled, he returned him. And then it placed a fetter on his foot. He made him a chain. He made him pass over by the bucano. Maybe that means he was sold or something. And then it says, quote, this one is a runaway. Capture him. He incised on his face, which would, by the way, this is cuneiform. That's going to be pretty big and pretty painful, by the way, but you're going to have this marking on your face that's pretty permanent. That'd be like having a big L on your forehead or something, like loser, like you can't get rid of it. There's even markings for temple slaves, and they would have a mark of a star. So if I look up the word kakabtu, which is one of the Akkadian words for star, which it has its own counterpart in biblical Hebrew. Listen to a person. I marked my young children with the star and gave them to the lady of Uruk. By the way, this means that a father or a mother, but here probably a father, basically marking their child so they going into temple service, which is slavery, but probably benevolent. And it probably means they're probably a family under duress. I can't take care of my kids. I'm giving them over to the temple so they will now be cared for. But the only way to do it is by the way to mark them with the temple marking, I guess. I saw the star and the brand on the back of the hand of a person, the slave girl of another person. And so there must be all sorts of reasons. And like we're going to find out later, there's a million different reasons for slavery, and there's a million different forms of slavery. When I say million, I mean lots of different ones. And some of them, this is going to sound really weird. Some of them are actually preferable to freedom in terms of lifestyle, which is bizarre to us, of course, because of our sensibilities. We value freedom over about just about anything else. One of my uncle teachers, a great uncle teachers, Oppenheim, he taught Bucciolati, University of Chicago, in an article for the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research in 1944, wrote a little note about a girl who was inscribed by her father, and he's inscribed, her name is Nupta. Nupta, the daughter of the coppersmith, and he doesn't give the name. He's an oblate of the Ishtar of Uruk, so he's a temple official for Ishtar at the city of Uruk, on whose hand her father wrote, as an inscription, she is a Sapiru and is sold her to an Arab in Babylon. And the Sapiru means scribe. So in other words, she's some sort of slave scribe, whatever that means, but it's probably a pretty high status. And it probably means that she's probably well-to-do for life now, but she's actually got a scribal note on her. Now I'm going to give you one or two more, and then the questions will I'm sure just be all over the place. Here's one by Matthew Stolper. By the way, in terms of when you went to all these stuffy Assyriology meetings, you always wanted to hear Matt Stolper because he always was hilarious. He sort of broke the ice at every point, but he's also really brilliant. So here's an article about someone talking about buying and selling of slaves. It says, Idin Naba, the son of Ninurta Nur-Uken, and Bil Ikbi, son of Ninurta Atzur, and all these other people voluntarily sold Tahar, their slave woman, whose wrist is inscribed in Egyptian. So there must have been slave markings in Egypt also, which, by the way, the context for Herodotus, when he talks about slave markings, it's in Egypt, and so that makes perfect sense. So really cool. So this is somewhere, this is in Babylon. It's actually dated to 27 January 484 BC. Xerxes, the king of Persia, is the king of Babylon at this point. And there's being a sale, and they have a girl who originally must have been a slave in Egypt. So she's got an Egyptian hieroglyphic inscription on her. Pretty cool. Then the last one, by the way, I've got is one from, again, somewhere in Mesopotamia. This is actually a Jewish source, believe it or not, from the period of the exile. We found a couple hundred documents now sitting in various museum collections and other collections, and I'm going to talk about these, but these are documents from Jewish exiles. Laurie Pierce and Cornelia Wunsch published this in 2014. This is text number 52 on page 184 if you want to look up this volume. And it says, Ikisha, son of Barik-il, that's the cuneiform way of saying Baruch. That was the name of Jeremiah's scribe, who, by the way, probably is the one who edits much of the Jeremiah source. He sold to Shalamu, the daughter of Hanan, Anamuhinana Taklak, his slave woman, whose right hand is inscribed with the name of Barak-il, her former owner. And then it talks about the slave transaction, and that's interesting. So here we are, Jews. And by the way, the people that they're buying and selling, the guess is that they're probably non-Jewish, and maybe it's even because of the prohibition that they know about. And so the prohibition in Leviticus 19:28 is probably making sure that you would not mark up a fellow countryman, because that's a no-no. You just don't do that. And there's no explanation necessary because of the ancient context. If the tattoo was a mark of slavery, then that's sort of assumed. Now, of course, I know what you're going to ask, and maybe you should just ask it first, because I'm sort of spent in terms of giving you content right now. And I want you to think about the method that I used to do this. I tried to exhaust the ancient Near Eastern sources to find out, what does this thing mean in its original context. I looked at what it meant to commentators. I didn't look at early church commentators because it just wasn't a thing for them. It was much more relevant to the Jewish commentators. Because, of course, they were still trying to actively abide by the laws of Moses. The early church, of course, not so much, at least in later generations. And so it's not up on their radar. So now what do we do with moderns who are applying it? And I guess my first comment is, Keegan, when you decided to put that on you, was it a mark of slavery?
Nope.
Okay. Just thought. But
I mean, I did. I mean, to be fair, it was a tattoo right after I got saved. So my tattoo says Abba.
Yes.
So I got saved. Romans 9, I believe. I should probably know the reference.
Yes.
I got it tattooed. But yeah, we've
got,
received the spirit of adoption.
Yes, and you got Daddy's personal name that only his kids can call him, Daddy.
Yeah. Which funny story? I got it tattooed at a pretty weird place. He's like, "Oh, big fan of the band." I was like, "Not at all." Anywho, so there you go.
So the meaning behind it is really important. And so I look upon this, to me personally, as a conscience issue. I talked about this in another podcast a couple of months ago, and I had some people writing comments like, "Man, I'm so glad you did it this way, because I got tattooed and I've felt mortified ever since." And again, an issue of conscience. But once I go into the modern, put it this way, I can take you from the ancient world to modern application. That's where I would say my expertise stops. It doesn't mean I can't give you my opinion about application, but my specialized training is over now. From that standpoint, and it doesn't mean I can't, give you my 2 cents worth, or maybe 3 cents worth now with inflation. But you know what I'm saying is that I'm no longer being as authoritative as I would like to be.
Okay, so I got a lot of questions swimming in my head, but let's start by going back. So we're in Leviticus, and so your argument is that they're not the same thing in terms of the marking and the tattoo, and that's how you separate the two, like between the cutting and the tattoo, because like you said, we don't see anywhere in Mesopotamia that it would have been done for mourning ritual.
The mourning ritual in the ancient Near East is you're cutting yourself. We're not told why, but some of the anthropological guesses is that you're trying to get the god's attention. Like, hey, look, and in fact, professional mourners in the ancient Mediterranean world, I believe, are almost exclusively female, and this is going to sound really sexist, but the guess is that because their high-pitched voice was easier to hear in the heavens, and so they're screeching, in fact, that also sounds really odd. A loved one dies and you have to go hire people to mourn. And you're like, well, that sounds cold. Not in their context, because you've got other things to do. The mourners come and they're helping you relate to the deity, but the mourning rituals sometimes had the cutting of the flesh, which is clearly different than incising something on your flesh,
like writing something.
Yes.
Yeah, because that would have been my next question, which isn't super on the tattoo topic, but for the, like, it always talks about the scratching of the cheeks and stuff. What was it? And like, why did they do that? Or is it just along the same lines as
I'm
that?
guessing it's the same thing. I was going to bring up a passage. I think it's in Jeremiah 16, but I forgot now, and my notes aren't. They're all cattywampus now. If I want to use an old-fashioned word that some of you are going to be amused by, but God's telling them not to do that practice where they're ripping the flesh. And of course, you know the passage in when Elijah is having the fight with the priests of Baal who are ripping and tearing themselves. That's not a mourning ritual, but I believe it's part of a ritual to get the God's attention.
Okay. So that one's obviously clearly, we're told don't do that. But then we do see it in later tradition with people when they sin, they'd flagellate themselves.
Yes, right. But that's so far removed from this, and I haven't thought about it. I don't know what the connection is, if there is one at all.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's a one-to-one
There
correspondence
probably isn't,
like you
because
say,
think
but
about it. Why do you beat yourselves in the Middle Ages? You're probably doing it as if you are sort of getting a head start on your judgment, maybe.
You're punishing yourself first.
I shouldn't be flippant about it, because obviously it was taken very seriously. But here we are. Here we are, two very, very reformed, slightly Protestants. Like, no, you oh, that's God that does all that, not us. We can't do any of that. And so for that, we look upon that sort of as askance. But culturally speaking, it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you don't do it to me.
Yeah. So then what's the main argument for, again, somebody who is saying, no, it's still prohibited for all time? If they don't separate those two, then would they just lump it in together? Or what's the argument for why it's still applicable today?
That's a very good one, which does not have a quick and easy answer at all. And so when we talk about this in the next episode, I'm not going to be comprehensive. I'm going to try to show you perhaps a method to try to understand how to apply that, because it's not just this. It's anything that you find as a prohibition in the Old Testament, the prohibition of pork and other things, and is there a difference between Jews and Gentiles? Because, that's a very, very big deal in the early church. Until recently, that was a nothing issue in the modern age. In other words, we don't separate out Jews and Gentiles, but of course it's become an issue, especially in, I would say, probably since the mid 20th century. It's become very relevant, and so it is something to work through. How do I apply the Old Testament? Do I just ignore the whole thing? Do I look upon it as a model? Do I look upon it as a shadow? Do I look upon it as something? Do I try to apply every bit of it? And if I do, by the way, my argument still holds that you still have to look at everything in context. And so now, for example, if I decide I'm not going to have a tattoo, now I have to understand the reason behind the tattoo prohibition was it was a mark of slavery. So why am I doing it now? So I have to ask myself those questions. And ultimately, to me, I think it's an issue of conscience. And so, I'm from a generation, I couldn't even, on a personal issue, I couldn't even bring myself to have tattoos. My mother might see it. You know what I'm saying? And I'm saying that, half jokingly, and she might even see this episode. So she'll see, that's right, Sonny. But be that as it may, I might not want to do it, but I mean, so what's the principle behind that? And that's what I want to bring up, because it's not a simple formula.
Yeah.
And I think it takes a lot of effort, a lot of serious effort, to try and figure out why is it that I don't decide not to apply these laws in my present situation, or why is it that I do? Because there are, of course, many Bible-believing Christians that honestly apply those laws in the present day. And so how do we decide that is the question. And I'm not going to give you the definitive answer. I'm simply going to try to give you a mode in which to try to address it so you can go on your own way. I'm convinced, I'm hoping that I can sort of get podcast myself out of the podcast in the sense that now everybody knows how to do this stuff. They don't need me anymore. Great.
Listener just said amen to that.
Wow, that was fast.
Just kidding. But why is it for you so important, the distinction between those two, the cutting and the tattooing? Why is separating those so important to the argument that from your vantage point?
Because the meaning behind them is different. If I'm cutting myself, it's either a mourning ritual or something else. If I'm branding someone, and by the way, I don't think it's talking about you branding yourself. It's you branding somebody else is really what's going on here. You're not allowed to do it because the context is slavery. It's slave branding. So those are two completely different issues, but they've been attached together in the passage. But my argument is that the fact that they're attached together doesn't mean that they're dependent upon each other. They're not related. They might be related to us because, well, you're cutting up your body in one way and you're marking it the other way. My answer is no. They're different enough that they have different reasons behind them.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing that it's solely theological, but would the theological response be to the current audience that's hearing it? Like you said, they just got delivered out of slavery. Well, sorry, you guys out there in the crowd, you're already branded, but we're setting forth a rule as to don't go, which is a kind of a message that God's saying all the time, follow me, don't go back to slavery, which is what they constantly repeat, which is a little bit like what you said, is some people decided to stay in it because it's a better life, right? They're not
in the ancient
they're not
Near East.
they're not a first world country where it's like, well, I want my freedom and we have the opportunity for jobs. Well, they would constantly grumble saying, well, we were better off slaves, take us back to Egypt.
Yeah.
And so as part of that message or the theology behind the law or the prohibition being, I just delivered you out of slavery, no generations going forth shall you brand yourself again, but remember that I'm the deliverer. I have set you free. Why mark yourselves as a captive again? You're mine and you don't need tattoos anymore.
Yeah, that's a sign of ownership. I really think you hit the nail on the head.
Boom. Mic drop moment for me. First intelligible thing I've said all podcast.
In the last 5 minutes, yeah. No, you're fine.
So staying on slavery then, so a lot of the poetic language we see is about the palm. So in the ancient Near East, were slaves typically branded on the forehead?
When they give us the anecdotal information, it's usually in a more discreet place, like behind the earlobe. And there might be a marking on the hand. And so, in other words, there doesn't appear to be a particular rule where you do it. And I don't know anything about farming. I don't know if you brand all cattle in the same place, but you probably would in the sense that any farmer worth his salt knows, all right, there's a brand over here. And why did they put the brand, on the...
Probably where they got a lot of meat.
Yeah, exactly right. So, you would, and so I might brand your forehead if you ran away 3 times. Now, and the other part is, what if I decide to sell you and you got a branding here? We actually have evidence of somebody being rebranded. Kind of like renaming Miller Park becomes, American Family Field or whatever. But so then, in other words, a rebranding, by the way, would be pretty painful for you, of course. Bummer.
So is there anything specific to the palm then that we see?
I don't know. Other than now, of course, when it's talked about God doing it, clearly the context is very different. He did it because because you're on my mind all the time. And of course, his beautiful poetic language, in the same way that a Hebrew male was supposed to wear the phylacteries on his forehead. Why? So they're always on his mind. That's the whole point. And then, of course, they took that uber literally to wear them. But of course, the whole point of that was that I want you to be thinking about my laws and statutes all the time. Meditate them, day and night. When you wake up, when you go to bed, make sure that God's statutes are on your mind.
Yeah, that would make sense because I doubt in the ancient world they have mirrors readily available. So you tattoo behind your ear, good luck. But yeah, your hand right there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, God wouldn't put our name back here. He's not going to see it in this imagery, of course. That's all it is. It's an image.
So then that continues out that the slavery prohibition. Do we see any differences between the current context of it in the Old Testament versus the New Testament?
In terms of the slavery prohibition, or what?
The tattooing of slaves, does it
Oh.
change over time?
In the Greco-Roman world, we have very minor anecdotal evidence of slave markings. I did not delve into contemporary Greek and Roman sources. I think most of them are the anecdotal sources in Greek and Roman writers. So I don't know if there are any. I didn't look into this, and so somebody can correct me if they know about this. I do not know of any contemporary Roman or Greek inscription that talks about slave markings, but I'm not sure why they would, unless because we don't have administrative documents like we do for Mesopotamia, where, I'm and the only time I hear about slave marking is when I'm buying or selling a servant, and I want to make sure that you know which one I'm buying. It's the one that's got the marking here, on his hand that it says such and such. And so, in other words, that's your identification mark. Most people would have their identification mark is a little cylinder seal that they would wear on their person, kind of like their ID.
Mm-hmm.
A little roll that we've actually found in graves. But servants wouldn't have that. All they would have is the slave mark. But like I said, it's hardly ever mentioned. Mm-hmm. There's no reason to mention it unless, again, we're doing a transaction. Or there's a runaway. Daniel Snell wrote a great book, Flight and Freedom in the Ancient Near East, where he's talking about runaways. And I didn't look through it, but I'm going to guess that he certainly probably brings up some of these documents where somebody that who the runaway is because they have such and such a mark on them.
Yeah, it's tempting. I got questions about slavery, but we'll do
Don't
entire podcast
even
on
go
it,
there.
so I won't.
Yeah.
So then in terms of, again, the tattoos with the slavery, so from your viewpoint, don't get it on yourself, prohibited here, but you think it's speaking directly to, like, don't do it to somebody else, your fellow Jew?
Well, I think that's the implication there. I mean,
could they tattoo a non-Jew who's going to be their slave?
Doesn't say. It doesn't say.
Do we see rabbinical tradition of where they still practice that custom?
No, the rabbinical tradition simply talks about their writing comments on this, and so the only tradition that we know of is that last text I read, which is from the late Neo-Babylonian and Persian era, where Jewish exiles are buying and selling people. At least in one case, they're evidently they're selling a non-Jew, a servant. And again, we have to talk about the whole issue of slavery and servanthood, what it means, because it's not identical to the modern day. By the way, I'm not advocating it, but we have to understand it in its original context. It's really, really, the layers are very, very different.
Yeah, because in the New Testament specifically, though, we do see Paul very strongly isn't prohibiting in some of the verses, but is strongly, well, he's not just getting rid of the institution, but doesn't also seem in favor of it in terms of we're not going to look like the outside world practicing it. We're going to have, there's better treatment, love, and respect in it. But would the New Testament theological connection be, well, continue to not mark yourself? Yes. Moses' people have been set free, but now today, don't mark yourself either because there's no distinction.
Well, if you're talking about, let's say, somebody like Paul, who is an observant Jew, and by the way, there have been new researches emphasizing the fact that Paul probably continued being an observant Jew. And the big question is whether he expected the Gentiles, You think about it. Here's a small Jewish population of Jewish Christians. All of a sudden, we have these converts that are probably 100 to 1. I mean, just thousands of them coming in. And the Acts Church now in chapter 15 is saying, what do we do with all these people? How do, what do they do with the law of Moses? What do we do? And by the way, I think they have a very particular answer to it, which I'm going to go into next week, in next podcast. But I think if somebody would have asked Paul a question, well, do you think people should be slaves? I think Paul would have had the same answer that Jesus had about divorce. You think about it, when Jesus asked about divorce, he does not go to a divorce passage. He goes back to Genesis 1 and 2. It's almost as if he said, have you read the preface? It's like one man and one woman getting together, and you're asking about, a loophole already. Go back to the ideal. So if Paul would have been asked, should there be slaves, he probably would have said, did you read Genesis 1 about the image bearers? Everybody is an image bearer. Everybody is royalty. So
well, that's what he kind of says, right? There's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free.
Well, and that, by the way, is in terms of standing before God, because clearly that's a metaphor. I didn't stop becoming Jewish. If I was a Spaniard and I became a believer, I'm still a Spaniard.
Yeah.
But in fact, I think God emphasizes the ethnos throughout, even in the Old Testament, the nations continue being the nations. They never lose their identity, in my opinion. They are not absorbed into becoming Jews. The nations become Yahweh believers. That's the ideal in Isaiah and other places. That's the argument I'm making. So they stay what they are, and you don't lose your sexual identity either, neither male nor female. It means that you all have equal standing before God. There's no hierarchy any longer, because you have to realize at that point there was a hierarchy.
Yeah.
It's
well, there's a status,
first.
but it's still giving that spiritual truth of like your spiritual reality, which is more true than your standing now.
Yes.
It would be, my argument or analogy as I try to unpack it, would be similar to the Beatitudes, right? Oh, you think, again, your status isn't good. We all kind of grumble, like what you talked about earlier in the episode, which is like, God, have you forgotten me? Like, it was, I mean, even sometimes after we've come to faith, we have a tough season. We have a valley type season, and we kind of go, my life has been harder since I became a Christian. Like, God, where are you? I thought you saved me. Don't you want what's better for me? And so, especially to them, the Beatitudes are, even though it seems like you're losing now, blessed are the poor.
Yeah.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, depending on which version you want to
Yes.
look. Blessed, like all these things. Blessed are the meek. Well, it seems like the bold and the brash people are the ones winning, the people that are out there, the people that are rich. He's like, no. Blessed are you who it might not look like you're winning now, you win in the end. And so, yes, they don't technically, and Paul's not telling them like, you're not a Jew anymore, don't be a Jew. But again, that spiritual reality for the slave or the free person, like, no, in the end day, it does. Your position and status isn't what's really important. Your eternal life and your positioning with God. So it would still carry that spiritual reality in a sense.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Sounds good.
appreciate you letting me think out loud.
That's all I do.
So I guess my last question then would about the slavery would be, and you'd kind of mentioned it, because I've read or seen articles on it where they claim beyond slavery they would tattoo themselves the name of the deity. You're saying there's not a ton. Is there some of that in like ancient Mesopotamia or anything?
Very little evidence for it. And so I think that's a rabbinical observation, but as far as we can tell, it's not based upon reality that I can see. Is that I didn't, I'm not, inscribing Marduk on my forehead or Enlil or anybody else. I don't think there's any concrete evidence for that. But if I'm going into sample service, I might put a particular star on me that would represent Ishtar of Uruk. And so So I suppose from that standpoint, yes. But I think that, and of course that was the argument that they were making, the rabbinical writers were making, is that you're not to write a pagan deity on your person, because that's idolatry. And since they saw this in the context of idolatry passages, that's the assumption that they're making. I think it's a very interesting assumption. I just don't think it pans out.
So at this point, with what we've looked through, what conclusion do you draw as like the main purpose of the prohibition? Is it loyalty again, or ownership? Loyalty is the wrong word. Ownership?
Yes, I suppose you could look at it from that standpoint, is that it's a mark of ownership, and you're not to do it. It's a mark of, well, but maybe from the negative standpoint, it's a mark of slavery. Don't do it. And so the ownership, in other words, you've already been bought by, you are slaves. You're slaves to Yahweh now. Okay, you are loyal to. And by the way, if you weren't loyal to Yahweh and you weren't loyal to someone else, you're going to be loyal to another king. You're going to be loyal to something. The ancients understood that quite well, that they were very, very vulnerable in their environment. So they had to be a servant to something. Everyone's a servant to somebody else. Spoiler alert, that's what
that makes sense. So again, Paul, I'm a bond servant to Christ.
Yes. Yeah. But my master is benevolent, and so it's not an oppressive servitude.
No, that's the servitude I want.
Yes.
Better that than anything else.
How could I not be a servant? I'm just a single human being on this earth, and most of what happens to me is not self-induced. In other words, things happen to me because I can't stop them. Obviously I need someone who's greater than me to protect me. Wow, that was profound.
Preach. Well, let's end on a theological question. Last one, and I'll probably ask it again next week.
You already said that was the last one, but go ahead.
I know, I lied.
You lied, yeah.
My bad. I was mistaken. So if it's this ownership thing that we see, ownership to Yahweh, is that a foreshadowing, or does Revelation just also confirm that idea in terms of the marking? Again, I understand it's metaphorical. I'm not implying that in Revelation it means it's actually going to be a mark, but we see you're either going to get the mark of the beast, or God's going to write a new name on us.
I would say it's analogous. I wouldn't want to go too far with the analogy, but I would say that yes, the principle is similar. I mean, what does Christ have what is written on him when he's coming down, King of Kings, Lord of Lords? That's identification. So think about
tattooed on his thigh, right?
What's the intrinsic reason? And so that would tell me that the tattoo is not intrinsically wrong. It's the purpose behind it that it's wrong.
Right.
Okay.
And again, I'm not claiming that it's literal. Just
right. Yeah. But
I'm not saying it also couldn't be literal, but I'm saying, but there's at least the meaning and the purpose behind it. And that analogy probably wouldn't be made if it's this really taboo, like total prohibition, at least in my mind.
Yeah, it's not. That's the whole point. But you think about it, if Christ has that tattooed on him when he's coming, it's almost irony. Like, in case you are wondering, you enemy who's coming, let me show you who it is. I'm actually the one that you've been terrified was going to be coming. It's like, oh, as if you didn't know by my all-encompassing divine splendor.
Love it. Well, we'll continue this on the next episode, because I still have a lot of questions. Obviously, if we're going to follow, if we are still to follow the prohibition, what do we do about the different verses about shaving your beard? We see in other places people being marked, or marks, or again earrings, or circumcision is technically a cutting. Anywho, so there's a lot of questions and a lot of theological application in the next episode. So I'm looking forward to continuing.
I won't be here that day.
Yeah. That well, neither will anybody else if it's just Keegan. But yeah, thanks again for watching. If you have comments, make sure to drop them below. We got our email attached. If you want to email Mark directly, ask him something that maybe you just don't want to drop in the YouTube comments, maybe you have something longer you want to write out. That's all below. Otherwise, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Buried Bible Podcast.